I think people who don't manage their time well fail as leaders, whether at a Fortune 500 company or at a brand new startup.
Raymond Stern, thank you so much for being on the show, 20-Minute Leaders. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
This is going to be so much fun. I'm not going to be able to do justice for the insane amount of things that you've done. But just as a brief intro, you did Stanford for your undergrad, very proud of that, and then a Harvard MBA, moved on to consulting, senior vice president positions at Intuit and Yahoo, venture capital, very successful venture capital, and clear path over the past several years, but you've also done the entrepreneurial journey yourself, which I'd love to hear more about. Raymond, there's so many things I want to ask you. I want to talk about leadership, I want to talk about scaling, about team building, but can you give me a little bit of a brief intro about who you are and what excites you?
Yeah, a lot of things excite me, but I guess first and foremost, I love helping entrepreneurs. When I think about my own career, the thing that I got the biggest kick out of was helping coach and mentor people, whether it was at BCG, when I was a partner there, and actually before I was a partner there, or whether I was at Yahoo or Intuit, and certainly in the work I do today with entrepreneurs. And so that's where I get my biggest kick, and the thing that gives me the biggest amount of pride when I meet with people, over time, many years later, is to see the great things they've gone on to do because they're amazingly capable, and feeling like maybe I had one tiny little aspect of that in helping them along the way.
So looking at these various experiences from an entrepreneur, consultant, and then venture capital, where are you most attracted to if you had to choose of these three fields?
So let me just clarify venture capital. I don't do a lot of venture capital. My work is mainly helping entrepreneurs with my time, and every so often I invest. But I just wanted to clarify that for your audience. But where I really get my kick is working with the entrepreneurs. It's, I love my experiences at BCG and at Intuit and at Yahoo, but I really enjoy the startup environment much more. And for one main reason. One, because you can just get stuff done, and right. The pace at which these organizations move is radically different than what you can do at an Intuit or Yahoo or any larger company. Now, I think there's a lot to learn from those larger companies, especially as you're trying to scale a business. And hopefully that's part of what I bring to the clients that I work with. So.
Right. Okay. So how many entrepreneurs would you say you've got to work with or lend a hand over these past, several decades?
Probably 25 or 30 where I've really worked with them pretty intimately. And,
Wow.
At this point in time right now, I'm working probably actively with about 10 or 12.
Wow.
And, the great thing is when I work with entrepreneurs, it tends to be on a long-term basis. I mean, these are relationships that I've built over time, and I get to see them from the early days to companies that are selling for billions of dollars and have gone on to do some pretty incredible things. So it's a long-term relationship, and I really enjoy watching that evolution and the amazing things they do with their teams to build great companies.
Incredible. Okay, let's start with your executive positions within Intuit and Yahoo, senior vice president. You're there, you're helping lead these billion-dollar businesses and lead strategy. What does that even entail? What is the role of a senior vice president at these two incredible companies? And what are, some of the key takeaways that you would take from those times?
Each role is different in that there's, it depends on the function you're leading. So I had the great opportunity to lead, as you mentioned, some strategy departments, but I also got to lead a marketing organization when I was at Yahoo. I led the at Intuit, I led the small business division when I was at Yahoo, had the opportunity to lead some of our operations internationally. So it's a pretty diverse set of things, and obviously you've got to have some expertise in the area you're leading. But the thing that's common with every single one of them is you got to lead. I mean, at the end of the day, when you're at that level in an organization, your role is primarily getting the right people in the organization and getting them aligned on the critical priorities for the organization, and then ensuring that you're you're making progress against those priorities. And if you're not, putting in place processes to course correct and get back on track and things like that. But ultimately, the common thing is one of leadership, assuming you have some reasonable amount of domain expertise, because at that level, you can't roll up your sleeves and do everything, right? I mean, the organizations are complex and there's a lot going on, which is very different than when you're an early stage entrepreneur where you're rolling up your sleeves and doing everything. And one of the challenges entrepreneurs face as they scale and grow their organizations is making that transition from I do everything to I hire great people, and now I've got to make sure that they do great work, and how do I facilitate and enable that in a way that's powerful.
I'm going to ask a weird question. What are some of the worst things that a person at the level of a senior vice president in a big company can do in terms of leadership? What are some of the don'ts that, because, a lot of the times people, and I ask, right, what should I keep in mind? What should I do as a leader? I want to know what I shouldn't do. What are some things that I don't realize that I might do, and I want to avoid them, purposefully?
Yeah, sure. And actually the flip side of it is what makes them great. So I'm going to give you the negative, but just turn it around and you'll understand the good part. I think oftentimes leaders don't get clarity on what they're solving for. And that's, they need to understand what are the critical levers that they're responsible for that are going to drive whatever outcomes they need to drive to support the success of the company. That's one thing. So if you don't do that, you're kind of screwed, because you're going to go off and do stuff in the wrong direction. The second thing that leaders don't do as well as they should sometimes is make sure that everyone is aligned on that, because you might know what you're doing, but if you don't get the entire organization aligned on the same things, you're going to get people going in disparate directions. And at the end of the day, you won't get to the end result that you're looking for. Right. And, there's a whole list of things, but I think the one that most leaders fail to appreciate how powerful it can be if they get it right is how they allocate their time. Because if you think about it, learning, if you want to impact outcomes, you can learn new skills, but that can take years or weeks or months. Whereas you can decide in a heartbeat, I'm going to stop doing this and start doing this, and then you'll have a better impact on those things. And that was an early lesson I had working for a great leader who came out of GE, a guy named Steve Bennett, who I worked for many years when I was at Intuit. And I just found that to be incredibly powerful. And I think people who don't manage their time well fail as leaders, whether at a Fortune 500 company or at a brand new startup. The most critical thing you need to think about is, where am I going to spend my time? Because that's the most precious commodity you have. And at a Fortune 500 company, you're generally not worried about having enough money, whereas the most precious commodity a startup has is just making sure they have enough oxygen.
Definitely. I had a fascinating conversation with the CEO of Super Tools, a productivity company in Israel, and he's now developing a new type of calendar where the thinking of taking ownership over your time slots through time blocking and different best practices. And one of the things we were talking about is how, we very easily can become slaves of our own calendars, and instead of the calendar working for us, we work for our calendar and chasing our own tail. I see that with myself all the time. So what can you do though as an executive? Because everybody wants to meet you. Your calendar is full, from like weeks in advance. So how do you take ownership over your time? How do you actually sit back and think properly? What are the priorities that you should be focused on?
So, I think it ties to the word you just said, which is what are the priorities? You want to allocate your time to those. So this is not whoever wants my time can have my time. Right? You want to invest your time in areas. And that's different than saying, I'm going to be accessible and make time for people to find me if they need to. But you structure that. You don't make that on demand whenever you want. And, I believe strongly that making time to engage with the broader set of employees in the organization is important, and certainly with your direct reports and the next level down. So you want to explicitly make time for that. So that's one of the critical priorities, is spending time with your direct reports, as an example. But it really is about being really rigorous on investing your time in those areas. So one is just know what your priorities are and for sure do it. The second is, we tend to be creatures of, what my calendar says. So if it says I have a 1 hour meeting, I'm going to have a 1 hour meeting. And the reality is, if I'm done in 30 minutes, I'm done with the meeting. And I find that I create all sorts of pockets of time throughout my day, and used to do this in executive, because I never went back to back to back. I would end things early. Just because my calendar said it was an hour didn't mean I was going to take it.
So you actually defied Parkinson's law, right?
Yeah. The other thing you need to do is make sure that the people you're meeting with are being respectful of your time. So for example, I don't like having meandering meetings just on random subjects when I have a one-on-one. It's like, it's focused on the critical priorities. How are we doing against them? How can I help? What are we doing to get back on track? And opportunities to give people feedback, et cetera. And it doesn't mean you don't allow some time for chit chat and BS and how you're doing and things like that, because that's important. It's an important part of a relationship. And I also just love doing that as a human being. But it does mean that you expect of others to be disciplined about the conversations they're having. And the way I do that is just encourage everyone, and I talk a lot with entrepreneurs about this, when you're having one-on-ones with people, make sure there's a specific agenda. This isn't like, what do you feel like talking about today? And in general, that agenda should be tied to what are the most important priorities that they're working on to deliver results for the business.
I had one of the most incredible leaders in my unit in Ep100 that he would not be willing to meet with anybody unless they sent him an agenda ahead of time, and it had to be in a proper format as a part of the calendar invite. And that was because he was just working, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. nonstop back-to-back meetings, and he had to choose which ones are most important. But Raymond, the most important question of the interview so far, what is this background behind you? Which beach are we at?
Oh, well, should I let you guess? You ought to know, given where you come from.
I'm going to guess Tel Baruch Beach, but I might be wrong.
It's Banana Beach.
It's Banana Beach. Okay. Well, I'm from Tel Baruch, so this is...
Well, and I was there last summer, having a great visit with family and also doing a little bit of work with some of my clients. And, I put it up this June since we couldn't travel to Israel, and I just wanted to be reminded of how wonderful a summer it was there. And you can probably tell from the plastic chairs and the, plastic bags with all the junk in it or the food.
It definitely, but really the sunset gives it all, because there's nothing like the Tel Aviv sunset.
I agree.
But we're getting way off topic. Raymond, talk to me a little bit about scale. What are some of the key challenges that entrepreneurs face as they get to a point where they're able to scale their business upwards? And I'm talking now as a young entrepreneur myself, that I didn't have yet the privilege of getting to that position, but I can't wait to get there. And when I do get there, I want to keep these things in mind.
Right. So, what makes in my experience, what makes an entrepreneur incredibly successful are the things that can kill them down the road if they don't adapt. And so what do I mean by that? In the early days, as you know, and you've talked to many entrepreneurs and know many of them, you kind of, you have to do everything yourself. And by definition, you're a micromanager. You're doing everything yourself. And so that's one aspect. And, processes, even if you're 10 people, you pull them together, you get in a room, you talk, you leave, right? It's pretty simple. But as complexity goes up, those processes break down. And so you need to think about what are some processes to drive alignment, to know how we're doing. And that's when companies start putting in place OKR processes. And again, you need to do it intelligently, not overkill and stifle an organization. So processes is something you need to think about. How you use your own time, right? If you hire awesome people who are world-class when you're scaling and growing and have the luxury to hire them, because in the early days, you can't hire them. You can't afford them and you don't need them. And so, but when you hire them, the mistake I see entrepreneurs sometimes make is they still manage them the way they were micromanaging when they had 4 people in the company. And the reality is, if you do that, you'll just piss off a bunch of great people and they'll leave. And so you won't be able to scale because you won't get the talent that you need to build an organization. So for me, it comes down primarily to, how you lead and manage in terms of the role you play by enabling others versus doing it all yourself, and making sure you learn to let go. Obviously, you've got to trust those individuals, and you need to develop that trust. And then secondly, putting in place processes for sort of broader management of the company, whether it's staff meetings, alignment processes, OKR processes, because the processes you used in the early days just don't scale when you get past 30 or 40 people. And certainly when you get into the hundreds, they just don't last. Doesn't mean you can't keep some of the cultural aspects, and successful companies do. Doesn't mean you can't keep some elements of those things, like all hands meetings every Friday or things like that. But even that eventually breaks down when you're multiple geographies and people are sleeping during the all hands meeting.
So, but then, as young entrepreneurs, first-time entrepreneurs going through this journey, first time you hit employee number 31, how do you even know what to do? I mean, it's not like there's a textbook that you can just go to and say, okay, these are this is how you now can go and these are the processes you should keep. These are the processes you shouldn't. Maybe an MBA is maybe that they have some relevant classes, but how do entrepreneurs get this information?
I mean, I think most of it comes from just talking to people who are experienced, right? I mean, and in a large part, that's the role I play, but many others do. They're advisors, they're experienced people who can help you do it. And I think the critical thing is not to do it when you hit employee 31, but to anticipate and do it so that you are there when you hit employee 31 and you don't all of a sudden wake up and go, oh shit, it's not working.
Right.
And so anticipating those critical milestones, and they're not as hardwired as 30 or 40 or 50. It's more just thinking about, okay, we've been working where everyone's in a room and we can talk about priorities, and now we now just need to start thinking about more formal processes. And so what do those look like? And maybe it's something like OKRs or some other approach to setting priorities. Maybe it's staff meetings on, as opposed to informal staff meetings, at some point building in more formality. And what I mean by that is going through the critical priorities. Are we red, yellow, green on these? Talking about what we're doing with the red ones. Talking about, as a team, how are we going to improve them, as opposed to a stand-up where we just go around the room and talk about whatever we think we want to talk about there.
Definitely.
And so, again, it's the anticipation and putting them in place so that you don't get, what ends up happening is some companies wait too long and then they grind to a halt. Because what ends up happening is the complexity kills them. All of a sudden, you can't know everything that's going on. You can't keep an organization completely aligned when it's 50, 60, 70, or 100 people.
I love it. Okay, so I'm taking priorities from leadership as an executive. I'm taking anticipation as an entrepreneur as you scale up. Let's talk about teams. What are some of your insights? Seeing dozens of entrepreneurs, successful and unsuccessful, what makes a really, really good team? Not just a founding team, but a good solid team that is able to take a business, prove it, and start scaling it upwards.
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of things that make teams great, and I've learned a lot of this from some of the great leaders that I've had the opportunity to work for.
Right.
And so let me just give you some ideas. These are not in any particular order. They're all important. But, a great team, gets back to priorities. They know what they're solving for, right? And if you randomly grabbed anyone from that team and said, what are the 5 most important priorities for the company? They ought to be able to answer that consistently. And if they don't, there's a disconnect. So teams are really aligned on that.
Is that also important on when the company is huge, let's say 200 people?
I think, certainly an executive team needs to do it. I would like for everyone, but if the people sitting around the table aren't solving for the same thing, you've got a problem sitting around the executive table. If someone further down the organization doesn't remember all of that, but they know what they work on, and they know, ideally, they know how it supports what the company's priorities are. So yeah, I think this notion of everyone knows what the critical priorities are for the organization. But there are a bunch of other aspects to that. I kind of alluded to it a second ago, this alignment piece. You want to make sure that everyone in the organization is aligned in supporting those objectives. You don't want people working on stuff that doesn't fit because, one, they're not going to feel good about working on stuff that doesn't matter. Secondly, it's a waste of resources. You're not going to be efficient and optimal in terms of how you use your limited capacity. Other things great teams do really well is they can balance long-term and short-term. It's really easy to solve for the near-term thing, and it's really easy to solve for the long-term. The hard thing is to balance those, and you need to balance because you've got to deliver for today, but you also have to deliver in the future when the products of today aren't the most critical ones, or you've got to evolve those products. You got to think about new opportunities. So that's another one that great teams really do. They balance those, and it's a tough thing because you're always going to be pushed to put the resources on the things that deliver today. And that's the classic innovator's dilemma, right? People who don't invest in the future. And I've seen companies get really screwed by that over time. The other thing to think about is that I think great teams do is they're clear on who owns decisions. And there's a big difference between having input and owning a decision. Great teams want the best input. But this isn't a consensus, let's vote. You want to be clear on who owns the decision, and ultimately a CEO owns all decisions, but you want to be clear on who owns those so that you can have, if you aren't clear, then the organizations are confused, or someone makes a decision and someone overrides a decision. And so you want to make sure that everyone's clear on who owns the decision, but at the same time allow for the great input, because you want the best thinking brought to bear. I could go on with a whole list of things. So tell me if you want me to keep going or pick some other topic.
This is just golden. I can't believe 20 minutes are almost up. I'm shocked every single time, and every time I think to myself, I should have called this show 30-minute leaders, not 20-minute leaders. I don't know why I cut myself short of 10 minutes of pure knowledge. But Raymond, before we leave, I want to ask for one key advice that you would give me as a young entrepreneur, soon starting my entrepreneurial journey, hopefully sooner rather than later with my own venture. What is probably the number one or the two top things that I should be keeping in mind as I go on this crazy path?
So I think the number one thing is make sure you really believe in what you're doing, because inevitably, you've heard this a million times, at every corner there's going to be a barrier. It's hard to raise money. And even the successful entrepreneurs will tell you at some point it was hard. You're going to have challenges in doing what you need to do in terms of launching the product or building the product. People are going to tell you no. You're going to struggle getting distribution deals or whatever it is you're trying to do to build your business. You're going to lose great people and you're going to feel it's the end of the world because I just lost my VP of engineering. And so you're going to continually be facing these roadblocks, and it's really, really hard. So you better make sure you really believe in it and want to do it, and that you're not doing it just because, hey, this is a quick way to make a buck. And I'm not saying you're doing that at all, but there are, sometimes I meet entrepreneurs that I don't really get that they truly, truly believe in it. And I don't mean in the, hey, I want to change the world, but they're passionate about what they do and they're willing to go through all the battles. And I think that's the most important. The second thing I would say that is most important, and it ties to what we were talking about before, is really about this being really, really clear on the critical priorities. Because, your time is so valuable. You don't have a lot of resources, either people or money. So you've got to make sure you optimize for those. And I find too far, in many cases, that entrepreneurs, they're just trying to do too much. Right. And just declare for yourself what those are and focus on those, and try not to get sucked into all the noise around you, because there's going to be plenty of it, and think about what those critical things are for your business.
Wonderful. Raymond, thank you so much for your time today. It's so generous of you. But before we leave, I need 3 words that you would use to describe yourself.
With explanation or just the words?
With a little explanation would be wonderful.
Okay. First and foremost, family. I love spending time with my wife and kids. We travel a lot, although not recently. And, but we just like hanging out at home. And, COVID's kind of brought even my kid at college. We're all here together, and really the silver lining is all of it. And we're getting to spend some great time together. And we love spending time together here up in Tahoe and things like that. So that's one. Secondly is just, I guess adaptable. I've moved around a lot. I was born in South Africa. We moved to Israel when I was younger, and then ultimately made our way to the United States. And I came out to Stanford and have pretty much been put. But you learn when you're a young kid moving around a lot. You just learn you got to figure out how to survive and adapt and fit in and make a go of things.
I can definitely do that. Yeah.
And then finally, Ironman. I've done Ironman triathlons, and I'm
full Ironman.
Multiple full Ironmans. So
we should have talked about this the whole time, not entrepreneurship. This is the most interesting. Wow.
Well, okay. Well, let's set up a follow-up on this. But I'm dealing with some injuries now, so I'm not sure if there are any future Ironmans. But it was a great mental challenge and physical one, obviously. And so, yeah, those are the 3 things.
Unbelievable. I was registered for a half Ironman about 3 days before COVID really took over. It was up in Napa Valley. And so I'm definitely way out of shape now. So I'm using that as an excuse to say that if it would have happened, I would have done it. Now I don't feel like I have to do it. Right. But
was that the one in Santa Rosa?
I think it's called the Napa Valley.
Oh, got it. Yeah.
So hopefully next year.
Yeah, definitely do it. You'll discover it's life-changing.
I'm sure. No, I'm sure. Raymond, thank you very, very much. We didn't even talk about J Ventures, but I want to thank you for being so inspiring and teaching through that as well. So thank you for your help over there. And thank you for your time, and best of luck through this crazy, crazy time.
My pleasure, Lichot.